I think we're recording. Yes, yeah. Yay, so we're recording now. But I mean, all of us know the challenges of the last year, personally and professionally, and the worry and the stress of like living, much less dealing with students as they're dealing with stress, and the difference between teaching online, if you go through Equality Matters or some sort of, help sort of packaging to develop distance education versus quickly moving things remote, the difference in the development in terms of the time and what you can do. And I think with communication, as I talk to people, it's just been a real challenge in lots of ways that other colleagues in, say, science don't have. The labs and the studios and the working in groups and the teams. We don't often tend to be a sort of lecture and slideshow kind of group by and large. And then that doesn't even count the, dealing with the technology or the challenges of disabilities and these sorts of things. So as I was thinking about what we might do for WCA, I thought this kind of panel would be interesting, if nothing else, to give us a sounding board of what we did and what we felt about what we did and what we might do moving forward. So with that, thanks for participating, and I'll just turn it over to Dave Black, and we all have about 10 minutes. As you get kind of close to 10, I'll shoot you a chat to let you know. But again, the intent is for this to be somewhat informal, and then if we have people join us, we can talk about what they did. So Dave Black from the University of Southern Indiana, take it away.
All righty, well, thank you, Leanne. Leanne and I, we have offices just down the hall from each other. So I'm from University of Southern Indiana, and I teach a variety of mass communication courses. We call our program Radio Television. And so that includes managing a television studio facility. So I come from a broadcasting background, professional background before I got into academia. So I wanted to cover some of the video production courses that I've taught and the challenges that I found when all of this hit. So last spring of 20, of course, that was unique. That was when everything kind of hit the fan. And up to that point, really, my use of online media for distance learning and distance classes was really limited. I taught some graduate courses where I used VoiceThread primarily, along with PowerPoints and playing videos and so forth. But really, my experience was not particularly in depth. It was one of the things I wanted to develop as time went on, and certainly this pandemic, made that happen to a certain sense. So when things kind of hit, I was just going to use VoiceThread again, and I used it in very much in the non-synchronous format. I would record my voice and I would put PowerPoints with it and post it up there and let them watch it. So that's what my experience was. That's what I did for the spring. And then, these kind of classes for me involve really kind of three different areas and three different kinds of needs and approaches, and one is, of course, just straight lecture, that exists. The other is, equipment demonstration, whether it be cameras and tripods and cameras and, facility machines and that kind of thing. So you have to demonstrate that, and then you have to let students work it, practice it in sort of an exercise context. And then the third area would be in software, right? Using video editing and graphics programs and so forth. So that requires demonstration, and then it requires students to perform that in the class as an exercise. So in the spring, coming back, I had an introductory production class, and I had an advanced field production course. And so in the media, in the introductory course, luckily, coming back without the pandemic, we were going to do a mobile video assignment, which meant using your cell phone and edit on your phone, which neither required equipment or software from the university. So that was really a good thing. And I think that's a little bit of my story is that I felt like there were a number of circumstances that kind of hit these past 3 semesters that fell into line that made things a little bit easier for me. So that was really good. I had already taught that. That was something we interjected a year before. So I was kind of ready for that. So that was good. And then in that introductory course, then there was that assignment. Then there was also their last assignment was going to be a television studio interview. Now that required, working as a team with directors and camera operators and audio playback and so forth and so on. Well, that wasn't going to happen. But beyond that, the other component of that assignment was interview. Learn to do an interview. So I could still incorporate that. I would have them record an interview on their cell phone and then send it to me. So we were able to go over those concepts and prepare them for that. But for the studio experience, which we couldn't do, I simply had to lecture that. So that was really something that we kind of lost in that process. So that was the introductory course. And then the advanced field production class, they were going to come back and start on a single assignment, a 30-second promotional spot for some student organization. Well, we weren't going to have student organizations, and we weren't going to be able to work with the equipment that we've been working on. So I had to totally change that. And basically, I changed that to be pretty much like the introductory course. I had them produce a video, a personal video about the pandemic. And so both courses basically did that. But being an advanced course and one where the students had already had that introductory course and had that experience, I thought, well, how can I make that a little different? Well, I'll just expand it. So it was longer. It required more interviews, sound bites, a little bit more complexity to the production. But they were going to do it with their cell phones, and they could either edit it on their phones, but the university provided Adobe software for downloading, which was that never happened before. And that was just for that emergency semester. So they could edit it however they wanted to. And so, but the deal was, if it was going to be longer, it needed to be more in depth. So to emphasize that, I called it a short documentary. That's the way I kind of framed the assignment. Now, whether it really was a documentary might be questionable, but that's one thing I tried to sort of push upon the students, that I wanted them to go a little bit more in depth. So one thing I had to do that I wouldn't normally have done was to lecture about documentary. So I had already taught graduate courses in documentary history. I had taught a special session course in documentary production. So I was really kind of ready for that. I could shift gears for that and kind of make that happen. I will tell you that the real unique thing, and I suspect a lot of you all saw this as well, if your assignments shifted to something about the pandemic, was that these videos that students created were very personal, whereas normally they would be doing subjects relating to the university or maybe the city or whatever, but it wasn't about their own personal experience within a pandemic, or about their family, or about their town. So I got a range of things, and it really showed me the personal nature of the students that I was teaching all the time. Some of them lived in some really neat places. They lived on farms, and they had pets in their living room that ran around in circles and did all these there was and some of these stories were really quite introspective and emotional. So there was a wide range, and so I really enjoyed that. So that was the spring of 20, and then we have a summer and we come back for fall and spring. So things are now a little bit different. The university is open if need be. So if you need university equipment, the use of facilities, then you could create a hybrid course. And so that's what I did. So now students were going to come back. They were going to start using our equipment again. They were going to be in the computer labs for software editing. and so forth. So for lecturing, for those courses though, I kept that online. But now, of course, for me and for many people, Zoom became, the big medium to teach lecturing. So we all kind of had to shift to that, pretty quickly. And I felt good about that, though. I always kind of wondered how I would do lecturing in front of, even though I teach video production, how I would do in front of a camera trying to lecture. But I found, for Zoom, that my lectures were pretty much the way I did in the classroom, except it was just, this talking head. So I did the lectures there. For equipment use, then, students can come back on campus, but there's going to be distancing, right? So there's only going to be maybe half the students in the classroom. However, whenever I gave equipment demonstrations, that was in our television studio. And there was plenty of space for that. The university put stickers on the floor where the desk had to be. So all the students were able to come together for my class. For editing, then, that was going to be a problem. Half the students in a computer lab. I noticed during the summer, our department has 2 different labs, and that lab was not being used during my class period. So I was able to take it up, divide my students between 2 labs, connect them by Zoom, and conduct the editing and the software use that way. One problem with that I didn't like was that I didn't want to have one group always in this remote lab and another group always with me in the regular lab. So I alternated them every class period, and that would be put on the calendar for them to know. And I just felt like it was more equitable to do that. So that's kind of the way I handled the editing and so forth. So anyway, I think just to kind of wrap up, I think, the process of adjusting to the pandemic for me, I think certain things just kind of fell into line as much as anything else. There were certain aspects that they simply could not do. And also, I noticed test scores were not as strong. And I think that is understandable. I felt like they were a bit lower than they needed to be. Students who were in the remote lab, they seemed to have more questions, and kind of developing. But at least on one level, I don't think I really got any major complaints or problems from this. I think in my analysis, whatever problems students have with me, that's the only thing they seem to mention again. So I felt like that was good anyway, that we didn't run into major issues. So that's the way I'll kind of wrap it up from here.
Okay, thanks, Dave. So I'll turn it over to Sakila.
Sakila, you're muted. There we go. Can you hear me now? I was just saying thank you all, and I'm happy to be here. And Dave was speaking of some of my experience. I was a radio TV minor, but I don't think I experienced it in the ways that students are experiencing radio TV today. But I'm going to talk about my experience from 2 different perspectives. One as an administrator on campus, and then one as a faculty member on campus, because those are 2 very different things. And we look at pedagogy in the classroom, I think, in very different ways. But I want to start first with about 1.5 years or 2 before the pandemic actually happened. About August 2018, I became the chair of my department. And at the time, we only offered about 3 or 4 classes online. And so one of my main initiatives was to increase graduation rates by increasing our online course offerings. So I had to prove concept, right? I needed to have more online classes in order to demonstrate whether or not this would actually work. The initiative, however, was met with a great deal of criticism. great deal of debate in the department. And so faculty who were actually against online teaching had four primary arguments. One is, and I love this because these are my conspiracy thinkers, and you often have to have your conspiracy thinkers to kind of know what the other side is thinking. So one was, this is going to creep into making face-to-face classes obsolete. We're no longer going to have a university. Now, we're one of the largest universities in the CSU system, so it's not that easy to say that we're going to become obsolete. Two, only certain classes, this is another argument, only certain classes are meant to be taught online. Okay, couldn't much argue with that, because we know that if we looked at the literature, there are certain kinds of courses that can be easily moved over into an online format. The third argument was people are trying to get away from doing work. Okay, that was pretty offensive to some of the other faculty members, right, who actually do teach online, who have a great deal of expertise in teaching online. And then the fourth argument was that online teaching is not rigorous enough. So we heard all of these stories about why we should not increase our online givings. Well, it took me from August until November to convince the faculty to give this initiative a chance. So I'm fighting every month. I'm fighting with the faculty. Just give it a chance. Give it a chance. Let's see if it's going to work. So the initiative actually was accepted. They agreed by November. And we moved from offering 3 or 4 classes to about 25 sections of online courses, maybe a few more with hybrid, some online and some in the classroom. And that was about 15%. They agreed, only 15%, no more than 15% of our course offerings can be online. Well, I moved into working with IT to have them to do these 4 2-hour-long training sessions for faculty. And it was great. They facilitated these trainings, and part of the, I guess the challenge was we didn't have an online teaching certification. So these sessions would count as pseudo certification, right? So certification was the we incentive. So faculty opted in, or they opted out if they wanted to be considered for teaching online or in some sort of hybrid format. We had, out of 17 faculty, we had 2 tenure track faculty members who had previously taught online, were experts in the area, and I was the 3rd person who had experience. Out of 75 lecturers, only 9 actually attended the training. So 1 year, 2 months later, we're at the start of the pandemic. Faculty had 1 week to train up and move their classes online for the remainder of the semester. And this was really, really difficult, very daunting process. So since the start of the pandemic, we all know that education and teaching has been like, well, at least for me, it has been like no other time in my history of teaching. And I've been teaching for longer than that, 28 years. 28 years, I was gonna say 20 years, 28 years. So teaching classes in an online format was a significant disturbance. And this disturbance was felt by both faculty and by our students. And so we're now in a position, not of our own choosing, where technology replaced our classroom interactions. So there are many challenges that I faced as chair of the department, but then also as a faculty teaching classes in the department. But the major challenge as a faculty member was in supporting students when everything seemed to be falling apart. Or falling around them. So there were several strategies that I used to help mitigate some of the pain that they experienced, and those are the strategies that I'm going to share with you today. So one of the strategies was it was necessary to help students understand that online teaching is not a hobby. It's not a hobby. It's not something that, faculty just do for fun. You have to explain the horrid and the daunting experiences that they were facing, and that it was likely due to the fact that online teaching under the circumstances of COVID-19 was simply just a placeholder. And so that's a very different way of understanding online teaching. You're not dealing with faculty who are expert teachers in this. This is a placeholder. Only a few faculty really know the theory behind teaching online. So it's easier to shift a class that is likely lecture-based, right? You may be having a really great experience if the class is lecture-based, than one that's predicated on participation, performance, group work, hands-on experience, in much the same way that Dr. Black was talking about with his radio TV class. Lots of hands-on experience. It's a little bit different in that regard. The second strategy was I had to reestablish reasonable expectations for my student work, right? Often attendance, participation, timeliness of assignment submissions play a significant role in how students will perform overall, or what the overall grade is going to be. Now, there are two books that I read that really helped me understand how to reframe my expectations around student work. And one of them was a book by Susan Bloom, B-L-U-M, Ungrading. And another one was by Star Saxstein, Hacking Assessment. Now, currently, I am the interim director of assessment on campus, so that resonated with me in a lot of ways. And so both of those books allowed me to reimagine my pedagogy and to focus on assessing my students' work by determining whether the work was proficient, advanced, or at mastery level. Now, that required me to do a lot of feedback for the student. I stopped grading. I said, I'm not going to grade you. I need you to be present. I need you to understand how what we're dealing with right now in our society, and then what we're experiencing in the classroom, because I didn't see that as being really separate and different. Faculty were experiencing symptoms of COVID-19. Our students were experiencing symptoms of COVID-19. Faculty members had to take care of family members who had been hit the hardest. Students had to take care of family members that were impacted the hardest. Faculty had to deal with friends and family, the loss of friends and family due to COVID-19. Our students also had to deal with those losses as well. The distinction is, as a faculty member, I still had a job to go to. And you as a student, many of our students lost their financial backing. So they were dealing with something very different. So I had to reestablish, how am I going to grade students and be supportive of their success and not their failure in the classroom, because of what we all seem to be experiences. Students could have worked until they met one of those levels. So they could turn work in over and over and over again until they met a level. They weren't at proficiency, which for me translated into a C- all the way to a C+. They had to redo the work. So they could have said, you know, hey, I'm happy with the proficiency, I'll take that grade. Or they could turn it back in and receive a better grade, maybe up to the level of a higher level of proficiency, or advanced. Advanced was pretty much a B-, anywhere from a B- to a B+. And if you've mastered it, you're A- to an A. So that allowed me to have at least 7 or 8 levels. And if you receive a 1 through that 8, that will let you know exactly what level you were at. So that helped a lot, because students didn't feel like if I didn't turn something in on time, they would be punished for that work. So I really had to revamp and reestablish how I was going to look at student work. Finally, I've been convincing students and even some of my colleagues that there is no back to normal. There's no such thing as we're going to go back to a normal setting, in much the same way that 9/11 changed airport policies and practices. The pandemic should force us to break with the past and to imagine new ways of teaching. And that's where I am right now, talking to my colleagues about how do we enforce, or how do we move into a new space where pedagogy is going to look different. The pandemic was and still is a huge rupture in our society. I've just had 2 friends, one who has been, who's had the vaccine, has come down with COVID-19. And so these are very, very, serious. This is a very serious pandemic that has impacted not only our regional areas, but the world. And so when we ignore the rupture, when we ignore the pandemic, or we refuse to acknowledge it, we miss the opportunity to innovate. We miss the opportunity to create, and we miss the opportunity to progress forward. One of the things that I have been, I think, efficient at doing is creating new technologies for our students to use. For example, I teach our internship course, and I actually designed and developed an e-portfolio solution. So part of what my students do is they develop and build a portfolio as the major project in the class. So the portfolio becomes part of the curriculum. Within that portfolio, there is an assessment, a career readiness assessment. And so now they can take this 60-item question assessment, and they can identify where they are as it relates to, are they top ready? Are they somewhat ready? Are they approaching readiness? And the most interesting thing that I've been able to find so far is that students who are communication majors in the major have the lowest score in communication. And so I'm finding that communication is not defined by many of them in a lot of different ways. And when we look at career readiness is not about how well you performed at the university. You can have a really high GPA, but not have the confidence to be career ready. And so I've been very innovative in developing and designing software solutions. And don't ask me where it comes from. I have no background in coding at all. I design. And so I've gotten an opportunity to really do that and to work with my students and to help them move to the next level, especially since we are in this pandemic and we have no idea how this is going to pan out if this Delta variant, gets some real traction, which it seems to be, happening in the US and around the world. So we don't know if we're going to end up back in the classroom, or if this new pandemic is going to force us to now move into another direction of coming back in an online setting for another year or so. So we just kind of have no idea. But those were my ways of engaging my students, having conversations with them about what should we do next. But as a communication faculty member who teaches primarily intercultural communication, interpersonal communication, communication training and development, and research methods, it was very easy for me to transfer some of my stuff to an online format. But that's primarily because I had a great deal of experience prior to the pandemic of teaching online. And when faculty have not been trained online, it's very difficult for them to kind of envision ways that they can move performance or their content in an online format. I can tell you now that Zoom breakout rooms have been very friendly, and students absolutely love it when you give them, I guess, really critical and great ideas or activities that they can work with each other and then come back and report that to the whole group. So that has been my experience. I'm going to stop talking now and let this move forward.
Leanne, are you frozen?
So we need to move to our next speaker. Sharon, you're up next.
So Sakila and Dave, I'm at Capital University in Columbus, Ohio. Dan Heaton also teaches there. It's a private Lutheran. So we have about 1,800 undergraduates. So I had very little experience teaching online before the pandemic hit. I taught one online course. It was Intro to Film. It was asynchronous, and I used VoiceThread. So when we pivoted, I thought, well, I'll work with what I know, which is that I'll work with VoiceThread. But one of the things that I realized is sort of over the course of this is that because I was so out of my environment, oftentimes my immediate solutions, um, they might work, but I hadn't really considered all of the implications and also how the students were going to respond to them. So for instance, which VoiceThread, which I had used for many years, if you've one of the things about VoiceThread, if you've worked with it, is you know that you have to have a relatively strong and steady Wi-Fi signal in order to upload materials to VoiceThread. So when I initially thought with my basic public speaking class, oh well, I will put my lectures up there, and then also they could upload their speeches to VoiceThread. I learned really quickly that wasn't a viable solution. Our iLearn system, it had a limit on the number of how many megabytes you could upload, so we couldn't use that to upload recorded videos. So one of the things that we realized at our university is that we turned to our adjunct instructors who had been working at so many different universities and knew so many different platforms. They were the people who, during this period of time, were like, well, have you used this strategy? So, we learned how, and they would, provide us with handouts. So it was this sort of where many of us who had been full-time tenured faculty who had been doing, what we had been doing in our comfortable environment, realized that we had sort of we'd boxed ourselves in. So even with learning how to get our students to upload videos to YouTube, just something as simple as, what setting do they put on their YouTube recording? And so the other thing that I learned was that when I was in the classroom, I had a way of delivering instructions where, it's written, it's in the syllabus, I say it, I ask them questions. But in this particular format, trying to get them to read the instructions, oftentimes I found that I constantly had to keep my phone next to me in the beginning because they were just trying to do something, it wasn't working, and so they would just text me. So, new ways of learning for me, new ways of learning for the students. The other thing that happened is that during the summer, when we realized that we're going to be fully online in the fall, some of our adjunct instructors chose not to return because they did not want to develop an online class for free, which I respected. But what that meant is that, for instance, I taught group communication, which I had not taught in more than a decade. Probably was 15 years since I had last taught it. And now I was going to have to teach it completely in an online format. So over the summer, they'd been giving us courses on Zoom, but there's a big difference between I've had a course on Zoom where now I have to use Zoom. I have to teach my students how to proficiently use Zoom, how to use breakout rooms, how to get them to learn how to use breakout rooms. The other thing that I learned was technology needs and sometimes how to ask, how to phrase the question so that a student will say, yes, I do need some help. Like, yes, my laptop isn't working. Because oftentimes, I would, I just had an expectation, for instance, that when in group communication, that everybody would come on their laptop. And I don't know why I had that expectation, but several of the students showed up on Zoom on their phones. Well, that's not going to work for a group presentation. Well, the reason they were showing up on their phones is that their laptops were not update enough to be able to, handle presentations. So then working with school IT to get the material. So throughout the semester, I was negotiating technology, but I was also negotiating sort of that delicate, power balance that you have, between a professor and a student. Like, I want you to do a good job, I want you to do well in this course, but this means that you need to be straightforward with me about, what you need to do well in this course. So after group communication, one of the things that we did is it became very clear that our students needed to learn how to present in a virtual format. So we had been talking sort of like Sikila, you had been talking about, like previously we had been talking about, oh, well, perhaps we need to have a virtual presentations class. Perhaps we need to be moving more into this environment. But I had thought that it was going to be an adjunct instructor who was going to teach this particular class because he had more experience with it than I did. But it just so happened that I then became the person who taught virtual presentations, which meant that I needed to get up to speed on not only how do I create a virtual background, but how do I teach my students how to get a virtual background. Now, Dan is going to talk later about our experience trying to direct plays during the pandemic, but this meant getting students ring lights, getting students green screens and all the materials that they needed. And then there's such anxiety with learning how to use technology on the fly, right? So I am just, like a week ahead of them. And so when they would get up there and they'd be doing their presentation and they'd, freeze, I'm sitting there trying to give suggestions about how to solve the problem, but I'm also trying to support them as a communication instructor. Because when your PowerPoint suddenly freezes, or when the video that you were going to show suddenly is lagging, I'm both trying to be IT in the background, like, have you used this particular suggestion? But then I'm also trying to be the supportive teacher who is trying to minimize their communication apprehension. The one thing, though, about all of this is that I will say that my anxiety levels and my students' anxiety levels made it so that I'm not sure that I can completely assess the success of what has gone on, because students sometimes would just drop out for like 2 or 3 weeks. I wouldn't hear at all from them. And I didn't know what was going on. And I didn't know if it was personal or if it was course related. And then trying to get them back up to speed, not only just in a content area, but in a brand new content area. Like, this is the first time we've taught virtual presentations at the university. So you're sort of you're the avant-garde, you're leading the way, and you're trying to lead the way during a pandemic. So I saw a lot of changes during the pandemic, just because we had to change. But what has sort of settled for me, I'm not entirely sure. I'm done, Leanne. I'll pick up anything I need later.
Okay, so Dan Heaton.
Oh, okay. So as Sharon said, I'm at Capital University, and I teach primarily performance studies and theater studies courses and a few communication classes. So I'm going to focus on the live performance dilemmas that we faced with the onset of the pandemic. And when the pandemic shut our school down, essentially, I remember distinctly, they told us on a Monday that by that Friday, classes would no longer be meeting face-to-face. And we were 2 weeks away from opening our production of The Tempest. And we had an improv show scheduled that week. In fact, our improv performance was the very last live thing that happened on campus until we did a show this summer. So a long dry period. I'm having technical difficulties. Hold on. Can everybody hear me? Okay, thank you. So I spent the second half of that spring semester and all of summer of 2020 investigating how do we do theater via Zoom? How do we do live shows? How do we do improv? How do I do performance-based classes? I felt like I was getting a handle on it. There are a lot of really helpful YouTube videos out there from people who'd been doing Zoom performances for a few years. So even before the pandemic, there were groups that were doing online performances. And so they had some really helpful videos out because they knew that everyone in theater was going to be coming to them for help. And so I was one of the many. So I learned a lot, or I thought I learned a lot watching those videos, and I watched some other theater companies' performances over the summer. I saw a production of Hamlet, Macbeth online, and a couple of improv shows from theater companies to sort of see what it was like. And I thought, okay, we can do this. Our school is letting us, they're buying a webinar account for the university. They said that I just have to tell them when our dates are, that we can get it all set up, no problem. But then the fall came and I was faced with figuring out how to do a live performance class, my intro to performance studies class, which has 5 performances in it. It's required for our majors. How do I adjust that for Zoom? That was not something that I was taught in any of those little YouTube videos. We have an improv comedy group that does 3 performances each semester. We have our 4 shows in our theater season. And we have a group called More Massacres Outreach Ensemble that does creative dramatics with local schools. And every single one of those had a different challenge that I had to figure out. So it was a year, well, now like a year and a half of constant learning curve. Once you thought you figured something out, something else would happen. You're like, oh, now I have to learn about this. It was very frustrating, but it was definitely frustrating in each of those performance groups. So in the performance class, the problem was usually in a performance class, students have a chance to interact with each other. They're very chatty. They form a little community together in class. They're very supportive of each other, and they cheer each other on as they get their performances, and they see people improve over the course of the semester. And it's just such a wonderful experience as a community. We're by the end, we're all like, yeah, that was great. Your performance was amazing. We didn't have any of that. Instead, it was cameras off, mics off, no responses to each other. You do your performance, then you turn your camera off, and we're like, clap, I guess. So there was no community building at all in the performance class. So I felt very disappointed. And none of the students showed any improvement from the beginning of the class to the end. So that was sad. In our creative dramatics group, because all the local schools did not allow people to come to them, it was really impossible for us to do that, since we couldn't do creative dramatics online with the kids. Their school systems were not even allowing us, like we said, well, can we Zoom in? Maybe we could do a little Zoom creative dramatics. And their school systems wouldn't let outsiders in. So we couldn't even access them that way. So that was pretty much a wash all year. It was also difficult to get people to participate, my students, because they didn't want to do online performance because they valued live face-to-face stuff so much. They just couldn't imagine. I'm like, well, let's give it a try. Come on, let's give it a shot. And then for our theater season, we had 4 shows lined up. We decided to do an online version of The Tempest, which we'd almost gotten to do live the semester before. That seemed to work okay, but then with each show that we did, we learned a little bit more. So like the first show, we didn't know all the technical things that they would need with their computers. So for the second show, we bought green screens and ring lights for people. Then by the third show, we figured out, oh, this is how we can do a little, make the backgrounds different. This is how we can work sound differently. And then by the fourth show, which was a student-directed one-act play festival, the students got a chance to see what it was like. And so I think it helped them bond with the faculty members who were directors, because they were like, that was horrible. Yeah, I thought they did fine. The thing that worked the best were our improv shows, which I thought were going to be the worst because it relies so much on audience interaction and feedback and laughter. And in Zoom webinar, you never get any feedback from the audience. But fortunately, because it was a core group of students that had performed together for a couple of years who were in the group, they were supportive of each other during the shows. So even though we didn't know if the audience was laughing at us, they were laughing at each other in our chat. Like they had the wildest chats going on during this improv show that I almost paid more attention to it than their performances, because it was so funny. So the bottom line is, it's a constant learning curve. We think we figured it out, but we don't really want to go back to it. So we're really hopeful that things get controlled with this pandemic so that we never have to experience that again. So I think I'm out of time. But.
Okay, so Bennett, take it away.
Unlike all of y'all, I'm coming from a disability service professional sort of perspective, and I want to encourage all of you to consider yourselves disability service providers during the pandemic, because COVID has forced us in very real ways to consider ourselves disabled across the world. And I want to talk about sort of three kinds of accommodations that came up from my perspective working at the Ohio State University and disability services there. But first I want to sort of like contextualize why I'm saying that we're all disabled by the pandemic. Because COVID has rendered our sort of usual spaces inaccessible to most of us, because suddenly as a world we are specifically immunocompromised, vulnerable to a particular prevalent pathogen, and we all have this impairment that physical proximity to others and even breathing the same air has become dangerous. And so our accommodations at the university have been many. Our accommodations across society have been many, and I have to point out, not been universally accessible for reasons of culture, race, class, economic privilege, and other sort of factors. But our accommodations have included body modification and medical interventions. That's what we call vaccination. We've adapted our behaviors and changed and stopped what we've done. We've employed assistive technology like face masks and using virtual media like Zoom. And it's that last technology specifically, that is Zoom, that really reveals that it's our physical space. It's our proximity to one another that is where the barrier to access is being located, the barrier to full inclusion, the sort of like infected reality. So COVID has rendered our usual spaces and proximity and those behaviors in those spaces disabling. And so that's the context that I'm coming from. And from that, I want to talk about three kinds of classes of accommodations that the university and all of y'all probably have implemented. Those accommodations for disabilities directly related to COVID, accommodations for disabilities that exist apart from COVID, unrelated to COVID, but gain additional sort of complications. And then the most interesting to me is the accommodations that we have implemented in order to accommodate for the accommodations for COVID. And I will explain what I mean by that in a second. So the direct COVID accommodations are pretty sort of obvious. We at OSU have implemented policies that the Disability Service Office came up with and communicated. So, for example, if you're being quarantined or isolated, we may ask for attendance modification and deadline modification, or because of illness or absence due to quarantine. Then there are disabilities that are specifically exacerbated by COVID. So those health-related conditions CDC is publishing that make attendance more fraught. So we ask for sort of hybrid course release or remote learning release. Also, anxiety and depression gets worse as people panic about the uncertainty. requiring that kind of attendance modification or extended times on exams. At one point, we purchased and had to convey lab equipment to a student so they could conduct lab activities, hard science lab activities at home. And then the sort of third kind of subcategory here of COVID-related accommodations are due to the home confinement of lockdown. We may be in proximity to other immunocompromised people. And while that exigency is not protected by the ADA, OSU thought that that was some way that we needed to meaningfully intervene. So while the vaccination numbers are rising, these considerations of vaccine quality and efficacy for different strains, people that are hesitant, there are religious exemptions that are coming up, these kinds of protocols are likely to continue. So the second accommodations that we've made have been for disabilities that are generally unrelated to COVID. And our office has had to innovate and adapt our usual accommodations to render these COVID disabled spaces as accessible as they used to be. And so let me illustrate the kinds of different ways that we've had to manage these other accommodations. So to begin with, arranging meetings simply to discuss implementing any disability accommodations with our staff have had to go fully online, and pro staff have had to assume new clerical and administrative responsibilities as the office is shuttered and student workers are no longer coming to the office. Getting Braille printed or getting books moved around to be digitally scanned and converted requires a lot more driving and creative use of delivery services. We started using phone calls to assist remotely blind and low vision students who normally have an assistant present to manipulate, to scribe, to read documents. Now we're doing it remotely. Transcribers in clinical settings have had to listen via microphones in a separate room. Interpreters, sign language interpreters like me, have had to use communicator masks in order to interpret when working live. But once, my take is that once these physical distancing restrictions are lifted, those specific adaptive procedures are likely to discontinue because they're generally less efficient and they make it more difficult to ensure the highest quality service. But there are some usual accommodations like exam administration and proctoring services. They became simply infeasible because they are contingent upon physical presence in a space. So that's the third group. That is accommodations that have had to be made for COVID-related accommodations. So we break it down. So like y'all are talking that you've come up with a lot of creative problem solving that has gone into preserving the quality of post-secondary education. And that those like Herculean kinds of adjustments that you've been making to ensure good teaching have themselves created their own barriers to access. And so one good example is captioning. Because it's a digital medium like this, it falls under the ADA requirement for captioning. So in 2019 in the autumn, we captioned about 210 hours of source content. In 2020 in the autumn, we captioned almost 600 hours of content. So 3 times as much with less staff and less of a budget because of the pandemic constraints. Interpreting, sign language interpreting, this is a 3-dimensional language being put in a 2-dimensional idiom. It's like losing one of the expressive dimensions of a spoken language, like you can't control your volume anymore, and it's fatiguing. Remote meeting platforms like we're seeing right now are not necessarily transcriber friendly. Getting multiple high performance software packages to play nice together with shoddy home internet connections can be dodgy. But the biggest impact has been to exam administration. This is an accommodation that requires bodies in physical space, and we've had nowhere near capacity to satisfy the demand for exam proctoring without jeopardizing health and safety because of high density, or else deciding who's going to get the accommodation and who isn't. So this is also exacerbated by some instructors who have been concerned about exam integrity and have upped the stakes of what software they're using to monitor for exam integrity. So things like Proctorio often get in the way of other accommodations that the students would normally be allowed to use. So exam services all but closed. And in response, instructors were advised that if you just have extended time that you need to provide for your students, that's something that maybe you need to consider taking over because we no longer have the staff or capacity to do it. So in some ways, these adaptations are going to continue insofar as remote options for learning are championed in the future. Though for our part, The Ohio State University is reaffirming its primary identity as a brick and mortar institution where the most sort of critical learning is expected to take place in person. So just to conclude, these COVID accommodations at OSU have met with some measured success. Some of these policies and procedures, like assisting blind, low vision students over the phone or these communicator masks, these are clearly provisional and we're only going to last as long as the physical restrictions of our shared space-related disabilities endure. Some policies and procedures are here to stay, though, such as the option to have remote meetings with our staff and the likely continued explosion of demand for captioning as digital access policies are more regularly enforced. But other policies like that remote hybrid attendance accommodation, we'll see what happens, and we're going to continue that on a case-by-case basis. It's my opinion, though, that the issues of accessibility brought about by scrutiny of these media through which we have come to communicate during the pandemic, these issues will only become more apparent and drive greater attention to the very human needs for seamless access to our shared, sometimes disabling social reality.
Thank you, Bennett. So I will very quickly give you a cap of some of my challenges, and I want to give us at least a few minutes to ask questions or share other things that happen. So for over 25 years, I've taught an undergraduate research class that required students to do ethnographic research. So going out in the community, participating, observing a cultural group or a setting, and then write up a descriptive analysis that gives us some insight in terms of the meanings that are generated by those individuals in that setting. Obviously, when there's a pandemic and everything's shut down, you can't exactly do that in lots of different ways. Previous to the panic, they would ride buses. They would attend traffic court. Some of them would research familiar settings like nightclubs or clubs they belong to or workplaces or where they did their laundry. They did a lot of third place research, cafes and campus hangouts and these sorts of things. But again, COVID made all of this work pretty much impossible in lots of different ways. And so one of the things that I did, and I think Dan has done this kind of work with his students, is switch to online ethnographies or a virtual ethnography, or netnography. It's referred to by a couple of different names. And they do the same sorts of things, natural social worlds, subcultures. They look at construction of identity, values, attitudes, and beliefs. But unlike most of the ethnographies, they're doing it on online world. And there are lots of challenges with this kind of research. And it's still so unknown in terms of the people who do it, that there's still a lot of things we have to work out, particularly when you start sort of pulling apart, different sort of ethical issues. I mean, you've got disembodied locations, you've got unclear boundaries, you've got indivisibility of participants, you've got the potential of lurking. So you have all these different adjustments that you have to do in order to try to do this kind of work. Again, with regular participation, observation, they can go to regular meetings and observe in real time. And then their balance of participation and observation is a little bit easier in some ways. Taking field notes, that becomes very different. In regular ethnography, you're listening to what people say and you're looking at what people do. Whereas with netnography, you're making observations about texts of different things. What are the images they're using, the textual things that in terms of typing in various chats, or their memes. So you're watching texts, not so much watching people. And then, as I said, there are all sorts of sort of ethical concerns to sort of deal with as well. In terms of sort of navigating the different sites and the platforms. And, if it's a private group, but there's a moderator, then what does that mean? You can have privately public settings, or you can have publicly private settings. And so I worked with students to sort of figure out the best way we could to do this kind of work. And there were a real range of projects that students did. And I'll confess, this is one of those instances, Sharon, you were talking about teaching your students doing Zoom and working really in some ways a week ahead. And I was doing the same thing. I've never done ethnography before, lots of ethnography, but not any in this sort of online virtual format. And so we were all sort of learning together. And to be frank, that's the way I posed it to the students, is that, this isn't something I've done. We're going to try this out. We're going to see what happens. And well, we're going to see what happens. And so students did some Facebook sites for football fans. One guy wanted to actually Indiana University. He's like, well, Indiana's not going to play football this year. So maybe we need to find, a real football place. And Alabama is kind of one of those places. Some student had belonged to a Disney Plus chat group, or a Reddit for bullet journaling, which I did not know what bullet journaling is, but it was a big thing for her. She was very much into it. And so she did her ethnography over those sorts of things. Others did sort of multimodal. One of my students did her ethnography over a Netflix party group. So they would do email chats to figure out what they were going to watch. And then she did, and her friends all knew this. So this is one with, it was, very, very open in terms of what was going on. Whereas the others were sort of moderately open depending upon the circumstance. But so part of the chats during the Netflix party became, her sort of textual messages. So Twitter feed, one student had a group of friends, and I think they were mostly friends or acquaintances, that were on a sort of Twitter feed for Cubs fans. And so analyzing that kind of communication. Moving forward, we're going to be doing the same thing this fall. Our campus will be fully open. At the same time, I'm not sure where this is all going to mean with the rise of the variant. So in order to keep students safe, we're going to continue to do the ethnography in this class in the fall. My colleague who teaches this class alternatively, since I have a new role in the department, she actually did the same thing. She hadn't heard of ethnography. So now we are sort of learning this together. The other thing that I wanted to talk about in the few minutes that I had is the sort of writing, because one of the big aspects of this course is that we work and we write and we rewrite. We do a lot of peer work, peer reviewing, and I read things 3 and 4 times and peers are reading it. And again, even though the class met face to face, we could not do that kind of group work. And so this is where breakout rooms became really important. My students would meet in the class face to face, and they pull up their laptop or their phone, and I put them in a breakout room, even though they were physically present in the class, because they could chat and interact about whatever we were doing. And then at the end of the sort of group work, we would do our debriefing, like in real time, in real class off of the Zoom. So I used it in that way. And then I did the same thing in terms of the writing. I had students submit to me a draft so I could read all the drafts. And then I put them in, I used breakout rooms to put them in pairs. And so while they were doing peer reviews in pairs with very guided instructions that I wanted them to follow, I would bring one of them out into the main meeting room, talk about their paper, and answer their questions. And then they'd go back in the breakout room with their peer, and then another student would pop out. And so I were able to use breakout groups in this way. And I think the thing that was surprising about this is that it actually kind of worked once we figured out the routine and how it was going to work. And this was also something that our technology group had never thought about, using breakout rooms in this way. So I felt a little superior that day, since considering I am hardly a techno person. So we have just a few minutes left. And I thought at this point we might open up our mics and ask people questions, or add things that we wanted to say and didn't, or make additional comments in just the few minutes we have left. Does that sound okay? And Stephen, if you would like to share something that you did, I don't know.
Sure, I'll briefly
I
say,
know
yeah,
New Zealand
thing-
approached it very differently.
what was interesting for us is when COVID struck, there was a big debate. I started at Massey, but it went to other universities on the place of exams. And what was interesting is here, we at Massey, and I think University of Auckland, Victoria, to a lesser extent, a couple of the other ones, but fairly similarly, basically said no exams at all, and that staff need to find other ways to assess unless it's a requirement for like accreditation or something. Like some of our accounting courses require an examination. And the interesting thing is the schools that fought it were humanities and social sciences. They were the ones saying, no, we want the exams, we want the exams, we want the exams. The schools leading the charge to get rid of them were business and science, to do innovative new exams or new kinds of assessment. And part of the reason I sent a note to Bennett, part of the reason is because of workload. And I'm not trying to be derogatory, but a lot of our colleagues in the humanities and social sciences argued exams are easier to mark. I don't have to do anything new. They're already done. Multiple choice is simple. Essays are easy. It's a lot easier to do that than it is to do something on Zoom, to create a new form of presentation, to do a project. And so the fight was with the humanities and social sciences, who you think would be leading in that space. But now, even if we come back from COVID, or when we come back from COVID, there won't be any face-to-face exams at our university, at least. They're gone unless they're required for an accreditation. And I can tell you in communication, journalism, and marketing, we have 0 examinations, including at our 100 levels. The School of Management has 0 exams, and there's a couple in accounting and a couple in economics and finance, and that's it in the whole College of Business. The rest of it, our staff rewrote, developed new ways of teaching, and it was really kind of exciting.
So
Send a white paper.
Stephen, are you saying
to
no
the
exams
business
at all,
school
or
that
just no
oversees.
face-to-face exams?
No exams at all, even like online. We're kind of like, from a pedagogical point of view, my own opinion is exams, I think, are not a very good way to assess people's understanding. I think there's better ways that are more practical. And I've always found exams, no offense, to be kind of lazy, particularly multiple choice exams. I'm like, oh, it's just, no. There's better ways to learn and teach. Even in a stats course, when I've taught stats, I don't do multiple choice exams. I've just found those are just, it's just basically memorizing things. It's not practical skills, really. And so, yeah, I mean, unless it's required for an accreditation, like accounting, our students graduate with an accounting degree, and they take one more exam, then they're an accredited accountant in New Zealand. So they have to take certain tests during their diploma or during their degree. Other than that, they're gone. Exams. I love it.
Congratulations.
Even that is
somebody else have a
interesting.
comment or a question?
Because I'm in the in the humanities, and absolutely one of the skills I had to learn was how to design an online exam.
For us, it comes down to workload, because we're also Australasia very much quantified like the workload for staff. And so for us, it came down to, I have to design a new assessment. How many hours is that going to take? That comes into my workload. I'm supposed to work per week. And so people were finding, even now with plagiarism issues, is a lot of the reason plagiarism is continuing is because the same exam is being repeated and repeated, maybe a case study changed here or there. And the colleges that were behind on it were humanities and social sciences. But thankfully in Australasia, COM is really not in humanities and social sciences. We're in the College of Business, and we innovate.
Anybody else comment or question or thought here? Okay, well, our time is pretty much up anyway. I appreciate your joining the panel and talking about your challenges and successes. And I guess that's kind of it for us today. So thank you, and we'll talk soon.
Thank you. Good to meet you all.
Good job.
Thanks.